working for you. A weekly talk radio program which highlights developments of national interest and the activities of your St. Kitts Nevis government. Join host Roy Williams as he presents news, views, reports, and interviews about everything regarding the activities of the Team Unity government and the building of our communities and the development of St. Kitts Nevis. Tune in and call in to interact with your government and share your views regarding the upward forward development of your community and our beautiful Twin Island Federation. Working for you is weekly, every Wednesday live from 1:30 p.m. to 3 p.m. on ZIZ Radio, Win FM, and Sugar City FM with rebroadcast on participating stations. Working for you.
Good afternoon, a pleasant good afternoon actually, and welcome to Working for You. I am Roy Williams. I want to thank you very much for tuning in to today's program. Wherever you are, we appreciate your company very much. We have just come out of some major independence activities. Of course, we had the unveiling of the statues of our 5 national heroes at the National Heroes Park. We had the Prime Minister's Independence Lecture Series. We also had the ceremonial parade, of course, at Warner Park to celebrate the 35th anniversary of our Independence Day. And I think that they were well supported, they were well attended, especially the ceremonial parade. Of course, it was one of the best that we have ever seen post-independence. So today, we are going to have a discussion on pesticides. This is Pesticide Awareness Week. And I will introduce you to the people who are going to talk about the pesticides and the pests and the insects and all of that. I have with me the director at the Department of Agriculture, who is Mr. Melvin James. Welcome to this program.
Thank you, sir.
I also have with me Senior Environmental Officer, Ms. June Hughes from the Department of Environment.
Good afternoon.
Welcome.
Thank you.
And I have with me Kennedy Paul, who is from Trinidad. You will hear his accent. And he is the regional agronomist at Caribbean Chemicals.
Pleasure to be here.
Welcome to this program.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And of course, whenever we speak about agriculture and whenever we speak about human beings, animals in general, life forms in general, we cannot escape pesticides. You know, pesticides to get rid of certain things. And so today, that of course is going to be our discussion. I would begin with a very simple question. Mr. James, what are pesticides?
Thank you so much, Mr. Roy Williams, and permit me to also welcome the viewing and listening public. And I trust that our program today will really enlighten and inform. Pesticides generally are considered as chemicals that are used to manage or to control pests. So we're sort of repeating the words. Pest means any organism that has an impact, especially negative, on plants and animals. And so that sort of is, you know, the thing about pesticides. If I may say though, Roy, this week is Pesticides Awareness Week. Mm-hmm. The coordinating group of the Caribbean Pesticides Board usually set aside the last week of September for us to focus on pesticides, the good, the bad, and the indifferent. if there is an indifference. And so that is why we're here. And may I say to you that the theme for this week is increase food safety, reduce dependency on pesticides by adopting integrated pest management practices.
Okay, let me ask you, what do you hope to achieve by Pesticides Awareness Week? What is your objective?
I think persons who are close to pesticides generally consider them to be sort of a necessary evil. We find that
Or a necessary good?
maybe a necessary good. It depends on one's perspective, right? And as we go through the program, we will get other persons' views. And there are things that are commonplace. You have them in your homes, they're all around us, they're in the stores. And they have served the community a lot of good. However, though, one should not lay your guards down. There's certain precautions. There's certain things that persons ought to take. There's certain things that people need to know and to observe. And the week is intended to sensitize all to the good, the otherwise, the bad, so that we have a comprehensive view, and therefore we'll be able to make the best use at the least deleterious effects. In my opinion, that is what it is about.
Okay. Good. Now, Mr. Paul, you're an agronomist and you have extensive experience in working with chemicals. You work at Regional Chemical, which is located in Trinidad.
Caribbean Chemicals.
Caribbean Chemicals. Now, what role do pesticides play in agriculture development?
Pesticides since the 1960s, right? And I'm just going to list some facts, right? The use of pesticides is directly, well, I could say that. The use of pesticides, right, has directly impacted food production, right? Crop production. So much so that since the 1960s, we in agriculture, or if you want to call the agricultural industry, have been able to triple the amount of food that is being produced through pesticides. Okay? Now, allow me to elaborate on what Mr. James said earlier, as if you want to call it a definition of pesticides, right? A pesticide can be considered a substance or an organism used to inhibit, right, repel, or bring mortality to a next organism. Most times it could be an insect. That organism could be an insect, fungus, so if you want to call it a microorganism. And even in some cases, pesticides are used to kill things like rats. Rats are pesticides. Herbicides are used to kill plants. Okay? And pesticides in itself is almost synonymous with agriculture. Without pesticides, agriculture wouldn't be where it is today. Okay? Now, before I continue, let me just state, right? Proper understanding generates perspective. And no matter the subject, and understanding, or no matter the subject, right? And understanding the benefits of pesticides is essential to weighing up the risk. Okay? And by that I mean, allow me to elaborate, right? Before we could form an opinion, or before we could start a witch hunt, especially in the public sphere, we have to understand pesticides and understand the contribution that pesticides have made to not only the way we eat, but also the way we live, right? Allow me to just highlight some of the contributions that pesticides has made to our way of life, right?
Yes.
Outside the sphere of crop production, okay? Malaria, which is transmitted by mosquitoes, right? Malaria could have decimated the human population, right? Especially when there were outbreaks. Through the use of pesticides, it was able to minimize the amount of, the spread of diseases such as malaria. And up till today, I guess the government still uses malathion to fog and spray, especially when you have outbreaks of dengue, right? Typhus, which is transmitted by fleas, okay? Pesticides were used to basically inhibit those fleas and prevent the spread of typhus, okay? And the bubonic plague, which was transmitted by rat fleas from rats, right? Pesticides were used to basically curb that problem. Okay? Alright. Now,
So we're saying then that pesticides have played a positive role in terms of human health and improved standard of living in general.
exactly what I'm trying to say. Okay? And let me just put something in perspective for the viewers out there, the listeners out there, so that we understand. Because remember what I mentioned, right? Proper understanding will shape an informed perspective, an informed opinion. Okay? Alright. The use of pesticide, right? 30% of all, 37% of all food produced in the United States, we're talking about wheat, all kind of different grains, right? 37% is lost due to pests. Okay? And that equates to approximately 22 billion, $122 billion a year. That is the loss. Right? Now, imagine that pests and disease are responsible for all that losses in terms of agriculture. Well, in the scale of the US. And the US is highly mechanized, right? Imagine little old St. Kitts, little old Dominica, where the farmers actually have to go down on their hands and knees, and it's not really mechanized. Could you equate those losses to St. Kitts standards? You know, I went to a supermarket. Well, usually as I land, I go to the supermarket. I like to gauge what are the foods that are being imported.
Yes.
Right? First time I see an orange that actually orange. Right? First time I see a tangerine that literally orange. And we know it imported. Now, the public puts the department under pressure down here, right? And they in turn have to respond to the public and I mean do their part. And the department always does their part in terms of guiding the farmers as to safe use of pesticides, right? And when I say safe use of pesticide, I know Mr. James is a strong advocate for adhering to the pre-harvest interval, and that is the amount of time after you spray that you could harvest. Okay? Personal protective equipment, right? Those are important, right? Among other things, right? But what tends to happen is the public, because a lot of the times they are uninformed and they hear certain things, right? They tend to put pressure. Now, that kind of pressure again falls on the farmers. But they don't realize without the use of certain pesticides, a farmer cannot or is unable to make a living properly. It's okay for me and you to say, you know what, I don't want to buy his produce because, you know, I hear using pesticide or I hear using some herbicide, insecticide or fungicide.
So we are talking about here farmers' knowledge.
Exactly.
And their attitudes and their perspectives on the use of pesticides.
Well, we're talking about farmer knowledge, right? And public perspective on use of pesticide.
Yes.
Right? And that is the important thing. Okay? Now, let me just jump to something else here, right? By the year 2050, we will have to produce food for approximately, I want to say, 9 billion persons in the world. Okay? And one of the ways that we can increase production and we can ensure that we get maximum from our acreages, because remember, as the population continues to grow, farming lands becomes less, right? Losses will even become of more significance, more importance, right? And pesticides is one of the fastest of agriculture that will be at the forefront of increasing food production to feed those 9 billion people. Mr. Williams, as it stands, 1 in every 7 persons starving in the world today, you know. And as they say, a lot of us going completely green and oh God, people in St. Kitts here hungry too. You have persons that poor, you have some poverty here in St. Kitts. Alright? Now, I'm not saying that food not available, you know.
And climate change is affecting food production as well.
Of course. But at the end of the day, we have to keep up we have to keep up with the times. We have to stay on top of things, right? Now, I don't want to take up all the time here just talking, right? But I'm very passionate about this, right?
Yes.
But however, recently, well, a man who got cancer, right, claimed, well, his lawyer argued that the warnings on the labels weren't sufficient, and they considered basically the I wouldn't call it the company's name, right? They considered well their actions to be malicious. Okay, so I wouldn't call the company's name because I mean we're on radio.
It's
Okay?
out in the public, isn't it?
Well, let them read it. Right? I won't call the company's name. And that person was awarded, well, the jury awarded that person close to $300 million or so, if I'm not mistaken. Okay? Now, we read that on CNN and BBC and all over the place. And you know what we decide? We form an opinion. Right? Now, we don't understand what really going on, but we form an opinion. Right? I'm not saying that the glyphosate didn't cause cancer. Right? A lot of the things we do could cause cancer. A lot of the things that we consume and we eat could cause cancer. Okay? But anyways, let's examine this. I want the public to think about something, right? You wanna ban glyphosates in different parts of the region, right? I know the public is pushing for that because they figure it's causing cancer. But you know the majority of the cereals and the grains that we eat have glyphosate in them. Right? Certain companies, certain seed companies, certain grain companies make GMOs, which are, well, genetically modified organisms, and crops which are glyphosate resistant. So the wheat, they spray glyphosate over it. Right? The granola, they spray glyphosate over it. Oats, they spray glyphosate over it. Hence the reason when we go online and we read up the effects of glyphosates and its residues in the crops, right? You see the cereal grains. Of course, it will have residues in there because they spray glyphosate over the crop. Down here, we don't have no genetically modified crops, right? The farmers use glyphosate to spray pests. They don't spray it over crops. They don't spray it in between crops. So very rarely, or in fact, it's almost impossible that if Mr. James and the rest of the department were to, if you want to say, bring down the necessary equipment and so on and test the levels of glyphosates in the food produce here in St. Kitts and Nevis, that you would even find any traces whatsoever. Okay? Again, in closing, right? I know I'm taking up all your time.
No, we're going to come back to you, of course.
Okay, right? Well, this is my opening statement, right?
Yes.
In closing, I will mention again, and I cannot stress that enough. Understanding generates perspectives, right? No matter the subject. And understanding the benefits of pesticides is essential if we are to weigh any risk or make any decisions as to whether pesticides should be used or pesticides should not be used.
Okay,
Thank
good.
you.
Now, you highlighted, of course, a lot of the advantages of the use of pesticides. And you said, of course, if pesticides were not used, of course you would have a lot of crops being destroyed and so on, costing billions of dollars, in terms of losses in a year and so on. So the advantages are good. But of course we do know that the use of pesticides, there are also disadvantages, and that exposure to highly hazardous pesticides is a major public health concern. So we cannot discard that view.
I agree.
And that there are risks that pesticides pose to human health and life forms in general. So I would ask you, June, what are some of those risks and some of the ill effects of chemicals, of course, on human health, the environment, water, of course, and plants and so on? Because, of course, if they've been sprayed and they go into the soil and they reach into the water table and all of that sort of a thing, I mean, we have to be very, very careful. And of course, the pesticides residue that remain in food and all of that sort of a thing.
Okay.
Now for the other side.
Yes.
Mr. Paul is very passionate about his side. So I think I need to come up with the same amount of passion for my side. Now, I wanted to start with this quote, right? Not all pesticides are harmful.
Not all.
Not all pesticides are harmful. I think Mr. James is going to talk about the organic pesticides. But one researcher, in preparing for this, one researcher said that the promise that pesticide brings for mitigating harmful bugs, harmful pests, the risks have now far outweighed the benefits. So I know Mr. Paul probably not agree with me, but some of the risks that we're looking at are the effects on non-target species. So you create a pesticide for one bug, and it affects other species.
Yes.
And therefore that affects biodiversity, plant and animal biodiversity. There is, and this might be human effect, but the uncontrolled use of pesticides have not just the plant and animals, but also aquatic systems, because they get into the soil. We have runoff, it gets into our water systems, and it affects them. And then, and this probably one of the aspects where it affects humans is, but not just humans, also animals and birds. As it goes up the food chain, is bioaccumulation.
Yes. Okay.
So a little bug in the soil that a bird eats, or that a worm eats, and then the bird eats the worm, and each stage it accumulates in the organism. So by the time it gets up to the bird or the animal or the predator, you have a larger amount, a greater amount of pesticide in the system. Right? I talked about the food chain. We could talk about that a little bit more. They are also for the aquatic biodiversity. A lot of us eat a lot of fish. And fish, it affects, because once it runs off into the water, it can affect plants, the aquatic plants that fish feed on. It affects the amount of dissolved oxygen in the water. And it causes, from my research, physiological and behavioral changes in the fish population. Now, onto terrestrial biodiversity. Research has shown that about 20 to 25% of the bird population has decreased since the use of pesticides. We have a lot of, I'm sure you've heard about it in the news quite recently, colony collapse of the bee population.
I've heard it.
That is associated or linked. One of the links is pesticides. But I don't want to be absolute. One of the links.
Yes.
Some Paul here on my left writing diligently. One of the links is pesticides. In soils, the microbes that lead to nutrient uptake, breakdown of organic matter, and increasing of soil fertility. Once you spray a plant, and rain falls or you water your plant, some pesticides will leach down into the soil and it will affect those organisms. And in reading, they were talking about earthworms, which is good for soil fertility, and also for birds. Birds would eat the earthworms. They talk about the significant accumulation in the mechanism of an earthworm. And then I come to the biggie, the impact on human health. Now, I do not disagree that pesticides were necessary to for us to experience this really good, healthy living that we have today.
Which, of course, Mr. Paul
pointed out. Of course, dengue, chikungunya,
malaria.
Thank God I'm talking about dengue.
Yeah, we don't
Thank
have
God
malaria
hasn't.
yes.
Or yellow fever, which is very close. It's down in Trinidad and down south. Let's hope it doesn't. Although it's projected to start climbing up the chain because of climate change. Yellow fever, which is very close. It's down in Trinidad and down south. Let's hope it doesn't. Although it's projected to start climbing up the chain because of climate change. The pesticides in humans, the guys who spray the fields, the research showed that these guys were probably the ones you will see mostly the effect on, but also vulnerable populations like infants, the elderly, persons with compromised immune systems. Because when you spray a pesticide, it's taken up by the wind, and I said it enters into your water, whether it's surface water or it percolates down into the soil. It enters your water, so it gets into what we ingest, what we breathe in, what we eat. So whether we breathe it in, whether we drink it, or whether we consume it on food. Pesticide residue on foods is a big thing. And I go back to bioaccumulation. It may be because Mr. Paul and his ilk will say, oh, but it's a very tiny amount that is left back by the time it gets to the table. But it accumulates in the body, in the fatty tissue. Mm-hmm. And so it doesn't break down. And over time, depending on your exposure, it can affect the human health. And I wanted to have my little notes here. I wanted to point out, pesticide residue has been found in the bloodstream of cancer patients compared to normal individuals. Right? It's associated with leukemia, brain cancer, lymphoma, breast cancer, prostate cancer, ovarian cancer, and testicular cancer. Right? I don't know the numbers on that. I didn't get the numbers on that. Mm-hmm. But anything that increases your risk, we already have a number of risk factors. Anything that increases your risk to developing cancer needs to be looked at seriously.
Right. So therefore, pesticides is one, but there are others, of course, chemicals and so on, that we have in our food and so on that are carcinogenic, cancer-causing. But interestingly,
let me go with one more lamenting. Stillbirths, birth defects, spontaneous abortion, and infertility. That's leaving you with that.
Okay. And to talk about the prostate cancer, there was a study done some years ago, well, recently really, in recent times, of a high level of prostate cancer in Martinique, linked to pesticides that are used in banana plantations. And some doctors came up with, of course, a damning diagnosis that those green slopes of banana leaves, turns out, they were a little too green. You spoke about, you came here and you saw the orange, and it's a real orange, the color of it. And the high cancer rate in Martinique, they said, was being linked to pesticides, primarily used in banana plantations to combat weevils. And according to the 2009 paper, this is 9 years ago, researchers found that the islanders' connective tissue was being contaminated by extremely high levels of a nasty cocktail of DDT, DDE, alpha, beta, and gamma, HCH, aldrin, and dieldrin. You would know what those are. You studied them, Mr. Paul.
All of those
and the
have been
paper
done.
concludes that environmental factors such as the intensive and prolonged exposure to carcinogenic, mutagenic, and reproductive toxin pesticides may be the culprit.
May be the culprit. So that means that is inconclusive, Mr. Williams.
Maybe the
We
culprit.
cannot go on maybe. That is inconclusive. And all those pesticides which you call, those have been banned for some time now. Years on top years. Even before I was born, those things were banned. Right?
Yeah.
And to put on that, I could list a number of papers to you about holding the guns in my pocket until, we reach this. I'm kidding. But there are a number of conflicting, right? Literature for the use of pesticides and against the use of pesticides, right? But misuse, she had some very compelling arguments as to the effects of pesticides, right? So if you would just permit me, let me just 2 minutes, let me just speak on a few things, right? So Miss Hughes mentioned, she mentioned the effects on aquatic organisms, right? You come in at the poor old farmer for spraying pesticides for damaging aquatic organisms, right? What about the oil miners? We gonna stop mining for crude oil? I want to know if it's because the farmers have the least economic interest, the least economic power. That is why they would be, basically they would be targeted as a culprit for causing, we could say, mutations in aquatic species and death of aquatic species. You have oil miners, you have boats, right? Who transport cargo and release their waste in the water, all right? Where, take for example, there's this thing, barracudas,
Yes.
right? They tend to feed under the boats and they pick up something called sequantra. I forgot the name.
Yeah, and they're full of mercury and stuff.
Yeah, right? You want to blame agriculture for that? Let's talk about that. Let me continue, right? Let's talk about the bird species. Well, we don't talk about damaging the bird species homes and building up new housing projects and all them things there. The farmers feeding the birds, we planting peppers, we feeding monkeys, we feeding wild pigs, and we feeding birds. You understand? They come in and eat pepper, they come in and thief potato. So we actually doing you could say the diversification in the wild or the ecosystem a bit of a favor. Let me continue, right? Soils. Now, there's a very intelligent young man down here who I think he did his PhD, and he have published papers basically looking at the levels of glyphosates. I think it was amine as well in the soil. A very intelligent young man. I don't know if he's still at the college and so on, but I met him a couple of years ago, a year ago or so on, right? And you know what his study concluded? And what's that now? All you farm cane for years on top years.
Yeah.
In Trinidad terms, we call it donkey years, all you farming cane.
Yeah.
Right?
About 400 years.
And the amount of glyphosates and so on in the soil is negligible. And you know the only reason why you would find glyphosate in the soil, and a lot of people don't know that, right? Glyphosate particles are tightly bound to colloidal fractions, right? So the substance itself, from the time it hit the soil, it has become tightly bound, so it's very difficult for glyphosate to leach. So most times, anytime you have agriculture anywhere and you test the topsoil, you will find that. But we look at things, we talk about human health. Let's talk about the carbon monoxide that is being released by all them vehicles. Why only don't ban some diesel vehicles? Then we could ban things like glyphosate, we could ban all the pesticides. And next point I want to bring up, right? Our household chemicals. For the viewing public, right? You really want to reduce the use of pesticides? Let's get rid of Bob. Let's get rid of Baygon. Let's get rid of the toilet cleaners. Let's get rid of those, the 7 only just put down for the ants. Let's get rid of all those things and let's see how life will be. Okay?
Okay,
Now,
I don't think that the argument is to get rid of, because we are looking at the pros and we are looking at the cons,
I know.
Mr. Paul. But what we are talking about, for example, what can be done to mitigate
and you
the risk to human health and health of other life forms, plant, the contamination of water, and all of what can be done to mitigate that. I think the issue here is
to mitigate
mitigation.
it. All right. And
Because
you're totally right.
I think that we totally agree
Yeah.
that pesticides are not the only risk factors for
Okay.
developing ill health
Stillbirth.
and so on, like cancer and all of that sort of a thing. They're not the only, but they are. They are.
Watch me. Misuse will be the first person to admit, right, my dear?
Depends on what you say.
No, misuse, you know that inconclusive is always a maybe. Watch me. The UN have done studies, right? And when I say UN, I mean the FAO. And again, pesticides such as, let's call it glyphosates, right? Unlikely to pose any carcinogenic threat to human health, right? The EU granted a permit to continue to make glyphosate. They didn't give us the 15 years, but I shouldn't say us. They didn't give the agro companies the 15 years that they wanted, but they got 5, right? Pending investigation. And you know what's the problem? Glyphosate on its own isn't so carcinogenic, right? There's something in the glyphosate that, well, you could say a trade secret, right? They just call it POE tallawamines, right? Now, that is one of the enids. They put it with the glyphosate, and that enables the glyphosate to work as twice as quickly, right? Now, when the EU granted permission to continue to, or you could say now, make glyphosate and glyphosate-based pesticides, right? One of the suggestions they made is to get rid of the POE tallawamines. Now, misuse, you're totally right, right? Agriculture and the use of pesticides, those things do contribute to, or you could say now, environmental stability, right? Reduce diversification, but what doesn't? What doesn't?
Okay, we get you out, but
Yeah.
but let us talk about the higher things. I mean, we have to use pesticides. We cannot get away from them, and that's a fact. And they do a lot of good, but on the other hand, they also pose harm to life forms.
Of course.
And so, therefore, my question to you is, what can be done to mitigate the risk to human health and health of other life forms? What can be done to increase our food safety? Because what can be done? Because, I mean, people say, oh, well, we're vegetarians and so on. But at the very same time, you hear the vegetables are still laden with chemicals. Okay?
We might hear
And
that.
the fruits are laden with chemicals.
We hear those things. Those things are inconclusive. But let's deal with the mitigation, right? Of course, the personal protective equipment for the farmers and
Yes.
the technicians who use the pesticides, those are important,
Yes.
right? Mr. James, as well as the rest of the department, make it a point of duty to invite me up here every pesticide week to do the same thing, which is reinforce the importance of personal protective equipment, right? And good agricultural practices to the farmers, okay? And under good agricultural practices, I think we need to consider the pre-harvest interval, right? The re-entry period, especially after you spray, right? Among other things, those things are very important, and I believe the department are doing their part to ensure that those points are driven home in the heads of the farmers. We have sessions, we have seminars where I personally train the farmers on the use of personal protective equipment, right? Among other things, right? Now, another thing that should be done, and I did my MPhil in biological control, right? So you could call me a sellout working for a thing company. Miss Hughes laugh at me, right? Right? You could call me a sellout working for a chemical company, right? However, I believe in an integrated approach. So I don't believe it's just pesticides. There are other approaches you could take, which I'm sure Mr. James will touch on a bit later. Okay, there are other approaches, but what I say in mitigation of pesticide abuse or excess pesticide use has to be, or we could say, an effort on not only the technicians and the personnel involved with agriculture and the shareholders in the agricultural industry. We must take a holistic approach. Everybody have to be aware. And it's not only the pesticides in agriculture that we should be aware of.
Okay, you're
Should be the
speaking,
pesticide at home.
a lot in very theoretical and general terms. Now, what I need really is some practical ways in which we can mitigate against the risk of pesticides. What
Okay.
are some practical ways? Let's get away from the highfalutin theory.
All right. Okay. One of the ways the household could get away, or they could mitigate the effects of pesticide on themselves. First of all, you need to wash your fruits. Let's say whatever you get. Sometimes we suggest you have just a little baking soda solution and you just give it a quick little wash. That will take you a long, long way.
Yes.
Trust me. All right? That will take you a long, long way. It is also important that you cook your food properly. Let's say you might have some potatoes or whatever the case. It won't do much, but it will help to a certain extent. Okay? And you just need to be aware. Take for example, you see whatever you buy in the supermarket and you figure like, yeah, well, you know, it's not from here, so it's safe. They will test your fruit. In the bigger countries, they will test your product. They will test the maximum residue levels in your product. But you don't test their own. No. You buy it wherever you buy it, whether it's Miami or whatever, you ship it down and you don't test it. So I guess the department could do their role in testing, which I'm sure they have done already, right? Just randomly testing farmer produce in terms of looking for the maximum residue levels in them, see if they adhere to certain principle, and by testing the maximum residue levels in the farmers' produce, especially when they bring it to the market, right? You gauge where they are, meaning like you gauge whether they understand pre-harvest intervals, you gauge whether they understand you gauge whether they understand how important it is that you use the right pesticide and you don't abuse the pesticides. Right pesticides for the right reasons. That is why I mentioned holistic approach. Everybody have to play a part. It's all the shareholders that are coming and, you know, mitigate
Right.
it.
What about farmers? How can they mitigate against the risks? Because they have to be using pesticides, of course. What about the person who is selling the pesticides? What about household use? What about children? Because, of course, you know, let us face it, there's unintentional and self-inflicted acute poisoning by pesticides. There are people, of course, who use pesticides to commit suicide. I think you're aware of that. In Trinidad, of course, they call it Indian tonic Gramazone and so on.
We love that down there. We love that.
You know, people with problems and so on.
Yeah, but
they drink all kinds of things. And of course, you have, of course, too, the accidental poisoning, you know, the attempted suicide and so on. And my thing is, for example, what sort of a community intervention can there be in terms of the safer storage, education, psychosocial interventions? The psychosocial interventions, because chemicals can be used and they can be abused.
Yeah.
There's intentional use and poisoning, and there's unintentional poisoning and so on. What can be done to mitigate against that risk? And in terms of farmers, in terms of occupational safety and health, what can be done to mitigate against some of the risk, of course, that Ms. Hughes spoke about, in people being exposed because it gets into the wind carries it, and you know, it can get into the water and so on.
Okay. Before Mr. James takes over, right, and gives his perspective on that, right? Allow me to give mine. And that let me tell you what my company does, right? We have labels which clearly outlines, right, the dangers,
the hazards,
right, the hazards, as well as possible antidotes, right? That is all part. My company also selects fit distributors, and by that I mean the Department of Agriculture and TDC, right? Now,
go ahead.
Yeah, and the TDC as well, right? Now, those distributors, I could almost put my hand in fire for them, because I sure they're not going to sell you certain pesticides without a permit, or without they almost certain that. Take for example something like Lanit, which they used to poison the monkeys. Anybody without a farmer's badge can't walk up the street and get that, right? You have to have a farmer's badge. You have to know what purpose you have it for, and I applaud the department for their efforts in that respect. Now, in terms of basically what I could say now, the unfortunate events surrounding pesticide, in terms of persons maybe getting acute symptoms, right, without they really know it, right? I would personally ban the use of certain, well, that's just my thing, ban the use of certain pesticides in public spaces. So
Yes.
you see all by the roundabout where they might want to be spraying thing, they want to be lazy, they don't want to cut it and they want to spray it. Of course, I wouldn't encourage that there, because you have vehicles passing, could take into the wind,
Sure.
and so on, right? On the farmer's part, right, we work tirelessly. I come here 4 times a year. all the farmers who know me know I encourage the safe use of pesticides. I always reinforce the pre-harvest intervals. I always reinforce protective equipment. I always reinforce the way you spray in terms of spraying. Right? You don't go and spray against the wind for it to blow back on you and blow. You understand? It's a lot of effort that is being put into the or I could say the responsible use of pesticide by myself and as well as members of the department. Right? But
Okay.
on the other hand, those that voluntarily poison themselves, those people have to take responsibility for that. I mean, if you want to drink some poison, same way certain persons drink alcohol and, you know,
Yeah,
a choice.
well, the question that would raise the Mr. Paul, you can say that is their choice, but the question that would raise for me is in terms of safer access in communities. And for example, what really is put in place so that children, for example, cannot get access to certain chemicals and be expose themselves to harm and that sort of thing. And the psychosocial, of course, intervention. Of course, you can say, oh, well, that's their business. But of course, there are people who are suffering from social and psychological problems.
Mhm.
And maybe the intervention in terms of that will prevent them from going to look for some sort of a chemical to try to harm themselves or to kill themselves. So that is the sort of thing I'm talking about.
I totally agree with you. But not anybody could come down to TDC and buy Gramazone or buy any type of insecticides. They sell certain insecticides to persons with farmers badge and the department as well. As for those persons who are suffering from certain psychological problems, right? They could take toilet bowl cleaner and drink it. They could take bleach and drink it, and they don't need no farmer's badge for that.
Yeah.
We can't really stop that. But I get where you're coming from.
Yeah.
Right?
You get the point.
Yeah, I get the point.
But then you mentioned something about hazards and labels and so on. And
Mm-hmm.
my question to you is, how do you classify pesticides? There's a company,
Mm-hmm.
Caribbean Chemicals, according to their hazardous nature.
All right. You have certain pesticides, right? That, take for example, we have extremely hazardous, right? We have hazardous, we have moderately hazardous, we have slightly hazardous, and we have, well, the green ban, which is very unlikely to cause acute effects, right? Now, those things are classed based on their possible or the potential effect on not only the human body, but also the environment as well.
Okay.
Right?
Okay, now, Mr. James, I see you're itching there to get in. In terms of the community intervention, for example, we can talk about, of course, the safer storage and education for farmers, the psychological interventions, for example. We can look at in terms of disposal and handling, dilution, mixing, application, and all of those things. Maybe you can speak to that.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. And well, we don't always have Mr. Kennedy Paul with us, and so
He knows a lot of the terminology and
yes,
so on.
yes,
Yeah.
I understand that. We would use the opportunities that we have. So that's understood. But what I want to bring to the table, in addition to what you just asked, is that I don't want us to get the impression that pesticides are inevitable. Several things were raised, and I don't think we have the time to really address all of them. But let me say a couple of things. There have been research and experiments about the hazardous effects of pesticides. The results are inconclusive. But we do not need to wait until things are beyond the shadow of a doubt to make a decision. If you look at tobacco, for example, 100 years ago, there were lots of things which were suspicious, and then over time, it began to be more obvious that certain ailments were more associated with
Tobacco use.
excessive use of tobacco. Some of these research need time. I will introduce something here. In fact, that is my opinion as well with marijuana. in that the research period for marijuana has been much shorter than many other substances, and sometimes it requires time and different target organs to really know what's happening. So yes, things are inconclusive, but I believe there is enough for us to be concerned about pesticides. I said earlier, for me, they're considered a necessary evil. We heard how life has been transformed because of them, but there are downsides, and therefore we need to be concerned. My role, I would like to present certain options other than pesticides.
So there are other chemical options and non-chemical alternatives?
There are other alternatives.
Okay.
There are other alternatives. And to me, we ought to put all of that on the table.
But
Right.
with the alternatives, of course, just like with the traditional methods, there would be the advantages and disadvantages.
Things have downsides. We need to be able to weigh. We need to be able to bring balance to the debate, bring balance to the options.
As
that are
Mr.
on the
Paul
table.
said, integrated approach.
Integrated approach. Okay? So if you may, I'd like to suggest a few things. I, for one, we understand the role of pesticides. I mean, Mr. Kennedy gave his good justification, and indeed life could not have been what it is without it, both for food and for health. June really showed us that over time there have been concerns. At first, we just emphasized all of the good things that these pesticides did for us, but people began to realize that for every good, there were some downsides. There are lots of discussions about bees. Yes, that the bee population globally and the bird population globally has decreased. And so glyphosate and DDT, and I must say I was surprised at the names of the chemicals that were mentioned in the Martinique. Those
study.
things were supposed to be off the table many years. Those
But the
things
study
have
was
been
done in
known-
2009.
They're known to be highly hazardous. In fact, they are a classification which is like the worst of the worst.
The dirty
You understand? The dirty dozen. The dirty dozen. DDT was something which was called out since in the 1950s and 60s. And it is surprising that countries would still really expose their population to those kinds of things. What researchers do, they try to, listen, some of these things have been studied for like 50 and 60 years before they are released as a chemical. They're not really, it's sometimes the way we talk about it is almost like people intentionally want to hurt a populace. It is hardly like the case, right? But as you keep studying these things, you find other things about them. Here are some things that we can do to get away from some of those things. Kennedy mentioned one, genetically modified organisms. But that in itself is another debate,
Yeah.
right? But it is something where you can have less dependence on the use of chemicals. Only because the things are engineered in such a way that they become tolerant, resistant, because genes are put in them that are able to, as it were, resist these things, or as it were, to be able to live with them. But then it brings up a different set of argument as well. But it is one of the options, okay? But that's a very controversial option. We may not want to dwell on that. So there is also organic farming. Organic farming
Yes.
essentially means we ain't using no chemical pesticides, right? We're finding other options. Again, a lot of people like to say, well, I'm organic, meaning that I'm not using any pesticides. If we can, that is fine. But over the years, we have built up so many pests that if you do not understand pest dynamics, not using any chemicals, very often you're worse off than without.
There are some other types of farming, though. For example, hydroponics. where you don't have to use all of this and aquaponics and so on.
Some of them you put them in the liquid.
You put them in the liquid.
Yeah, you put them in the liquid.
It's just that it's not in the soil.
You're
I
exposed to
see.
them,
Well,
right?
Do you use no herbicides because you?
But that's one way of reducing the use, though.
Yes, in a sense. Yes. And we push a lot for organic farming this time. But what I would want to emphasize is something we call integrated pest management. It says we will use chemicals if we have to, and only when we have to. But we will look at other options. Because
Yes.
indeed and in fact, there are other things. Remember, pesticides became popular in the late 1900s, I think, right? But before that, people use what we call the traditional means, things. Granted, the output wasn't, well, it depends on how you view it. Sometimes,
What are some of those?
yes, you have common cultural methods, meaning like you could, depending on your type of pest and your pest population, you could take them off with your hand. If you have a lot of caterpillars, you remember recently in Africa, they used to kill locusts with a broom. They run through the field and they just beat
But
down
that
the
sounds
swarm.
disgusting and time consuming.
But it has no deleterious effects on your health.
Yes, but
Right.
it is very labor intensive.
It is labor intensive, but that doesn't. But I mean, this is it. When we're going to move away from pesticides, these are some of the options that we have to face.
Okay.
If in truth and in fact, because there's a part that we keep leaving out, we want the output, we want production to be the same. I mean, you want that when you go in the supermarket, the shelves are still loaded with what you want. So if you're not going to use these things, sometimes it requires more labor to get it done. It means as well, sometimes you have to take a fruit with a bite in it.
I remember a few years ago, Mr. James, when I was growing up, we seemed to have had a caterpillar plague. There were caterpillars all over. Do you remember that? All in the streets and all of that sort of a thing.
Sometimes you get an upsurge. But I'll tell you this, a lot of good quiet work have gone on in St. Kitts. Cardi, SSMC, and those persons, one of the things that they brought, especially maybe before your times and mine perhaps, it seemed to me like the sweet prickle. We are close to Ras, so we know sweet prickle.
Yes.
There was a time that the plant was considered to be a pest. And they didn't control it with chemicals. You know what they brought in? They brought in a moth or a caterpillar to eat it down. Mr. Martin is still around. At that time, he was in agriculture.
Ken Martin.
Ken Martin. And Ken told me that he was the individual to take the jar with these insects over to Nevis. They came into St. Kitts, and he was the one who took them over to Nevis. So basically, that was what you call like biological control, where you take a live organism to control your problem. So they brought in these caterpillars, and they released them on the cactus, and they feed down the cactus to help to bring the numbers down. Because during those days, cactus was everywhere. So even in the case with caterpillars, you can bring in certain butterflies that love to lay their eggs on caterpillars. So what these butterflies will do, they will alight or they would land on the caterpillar and lay their eggs. So you see the butterfly with 4 or 5 eggs on its back. And when these eggs hatch out, they will use that big caterpillar as their food. So they will eat it down, they will eat it to death. You get rid of your caterpillars. So these are options. We do not always have to rely on chemicals. But when we're making these changes, there are other changes.
Yes.
In that, as you said, some of them are labor intensive. Some of them you have to plant many things in one field. We're accustomed to a field of sugarcane, a field of broccoli. But in some instances, you may have to mix broccoli, lettuce, cabbage, cauliflower, and all of those together. Intercropping, intermixing. When you do that, sometimes it helps. It comes with a different mindset. It comes with a different approach. So all these are options we need to consider. It doesn't mean that we're not going to use pesticides, but it reduces the need for pesticides.
Mr. Paul, what are you for? Are you for the pesticides, the traditional pesticides, or are you for the alternatives? Because you seem to put up a very staunch defense
No, of course.
for pesticides earlier, advocating their use.
Of course. I advocate the use of pesticide, but I am in agreement with Mr. James. Right? An integrated approach is necessary. Right? However, in an integrated approach, we have to understand certain things, right? Certain forms, when we do an integrated approach, certain forms like the labor-intensive forms of control, that's going to drive up the cost of your food. Because you don't have no way you have an acre of cabbage with the cabbage worm on it and you go in and pass wrong and hand pick those things. Right? That is just too much work. By the time you get wrong, the eggs on the next side hatch already. You just had a cycle, right? But I understand where Mr. James is coming from, right?
Yeah, but those you understand, those are generic examples. In
Yeah.
that, for example, you still have microbial like BT that you could use on certain things. So it depends on your scale of operation and maybe the type of pest. Some things can be handpicked, especially if it's a small scale.
Yeah.
Others you could use what they call entomopathogenic organisms,
fungi.
right?
Yeah.
Fungi, bacteria, and so on. So there are different options, and in fact, a lot of these kind of things are now being practiced even by first world commercial producers and so on, because we need to reduce our reliance on these chemicals. When we say chemical, we're really more talking about the more harmful one. We're not so much talking about the plant extracts like neem and those kind of things. We understand, right? We're using it on the more harsh stuff. And let me say this too, that the present chemicals which are under focus, the glyphosate, the imidacloprid, even DDT and so on, eventually others are going to be under the microscope because generally they have their downsides. But we have to decide, because in truth and in fact, the monitoring agencies, they allow certain quantities in the body because they realize you really can't go without them. As June says, you check your milk, you check your honey, you check your cornflakes and so on. They're in there. So the question is, what level can you have without it really affecting you in your life?
Yeah, and I suppose that is where we're going to talk about quality control of pesticides and products and all of that sort of it. But we have to go to the phone lines now.
Okay, yeah.
I'm sure we have the
because
public.
we haven't been able to address half of the things that came up.
Yeah, the public is
Yes,
listening, and of course,
please.
you may want to know how much chemicals you're ingesting when you eat your apples and your grapes and your cereal and so on. But better believe it, you are ingesting chemicals. How much of it? It depends on how much you eat. Now, the numbers are to call. The overseas number is 1718-577-2916. That's the overseas number. And the local number is 465-2555. We await your calls.
You know, Lesroy, Kennedy made a good point.
Yes.
And it is true that we focus a lot on the local farmers. But, you know, in St. Kitts, for every 10 pounds of food that we consume, 9 pounds is imported.
For sure.
Yeah. And
Sure.
we have a lab that have tested the local food for pesticide residues. And we've tested imported food for pesticide residues. And those foods that were tested, the imported having more residues than the local.
And do you know, though, that the import bill for agricultural produce is actually too high? What are we doing in agriculture? I mean, I know we say we focus a lot on agriculture, but I really think that's an overstatement.
Oh, you know it is.
It is an
I
overstatement.
think the output is largely related to by the contribution in the budget.
Yeah.
Obviously, in my opinion, yes, there's always improvement, but I think a fair amount is done for the resources given.
Working for you, good afternoon.
Mr. Williams. Hello,
Good afternoon to you. Yes, I'm hearing you.
And good afternoon to the export here from the agriculture department or whatever department you're all from. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So, I hear you talk about the worms and the butterflies and all the insect them, so they just go on plants and feed on the trees them and feed on the bush and so.
Yes.
I remember back in the 70s, you had a load of, when the place get green and a lot of rainfall, you see a lot of butterfly, you see a lot of worm. Sometimes you got to spray, you got to get this thing they call sevin,
Yes.
and spray those worms, to keep down those things. But you ain't seen them like before. The reason for that, like, they ain't seen them now. You got the cane field and that milky bush and all those things. And those bush where you to harbor in the cane field and so. After they start to split the cane field them, those things die out gradually. So you don't see much of them around. You don't even see butterfly now.
Right.
I don't want to see a butterfly. I go mountain almost every day. And if I see a butterfly, and occasionally I might tell you just a little small one.
You are extremely correct with that.
So I believe that is why so much insect is not around now, because the chemical war around now kill out all the insect them. But I believe that the insect them too was around. It was important, because they help. They will exactly to show you that whether the soil healthy or not when these weeds come up.
Yes.
And I believe that too, that the neem bush is not a pesticide.
Yes, it is.
It is.
You
It's
don't think you
used.
could take the neem bush and make some kind of pesticide with it to kill out insect and all those things we go on plant. Instead, because let me tell you something, right? I know the neem bush so good, right? I had a time that I had some the small little cockroaches with us butter in your cupboards and so. We never used to see them before. So some of them they come in and they come in the container them and so. And to be truthful, I put some neem bush in the cupboard. And let me tell you, I don't know where they disappear. Up to now, I don't see one insect around when I have the neem bush around. So I believe those neem bush are important, and I believe that we could do something with them to make pesticides to kill the insect going on the plant. Because I believe that they're more healthier to use than to use the real chemical. All right then.
Okay, thank you so much. Working for you, good afternoon. Hello?
Hello.
Yes,
Hello, man.
good afternoon.
Yes, good day. Talking about pesticides, what effect does that have on the bees which are used for pollinating the plants? Could you just talk to me about that? Because following up from what the previous caller said about butterflies, I'm noticing that I'm not seeing an awful lot of bees. I'm not seeing a hell of a lot of bees around as I used to. So I'm wondering if you're killing out our bees as well.
Okay.
So I'll listen to hear the explanation.
Okay. Working for you, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, exports. How you all doing?
Very well, thank you.
Yeah, I just hear the caller say that the neem bush kill his little cockroach them, but I could tell him that the neem bush is good for diabetes.
Yeah, it's good for many health things as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
And since there are so many, they're recalling so many chemicals off the shelf because they are so hazardous to human health and whatnot. Let us go back to our cultural stuff. The best way to get rid of any pest, look for them. When you meet them, kill them. Thank you.
Okay. There were a number of things that, of course, came up there.
Yeah.
Of course, you mentioned the working for you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Yes. We're hearing you.
Hello, let me turn on the radio.
Yes, please. Working for you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Yes. We're hearing you.
Hello, let me turn on the radio.
Yes, please.
I'm calling to remind you all. There was a year there in the 70s when SSMC bring the Furidan. Kill off almost half of the population and the birds. Because they brought it in a black color and the birds start with seeds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
The gramazone thing too. I was living in Newtown when they spray it up and they come down, burn down the skinny tree and the what's not tree. Yeah, anyhow, that's my good little input.
Okay, thank you so much for your input.
Furidan.
Okay, you may want to address some of the
Yeah,
things, of course.
I could touch on so many of these. Yes, Furidan, the appearance of Furidan, it actually looked something like what we call sisal. So yeah, and sisal is something the birds eat. We no longer import Furidan but although it was considered as one of our magic stuff, it's very broad spectrum, but it was also very, very toxic. So yeah, we had to get rid of it. I'm going to just say a little about the bees, and maybe June might want to say some more about it. But yes, we said that bees and birds, research have shown that their population has been going down over the last 10 years. With bees in particular, yes, again, there's a suspicion. In other words, there are several factors responsible for the decline in the bee population, one of which is climate change, and another is the presence of systemic insecticides, imidacloprid in particular. So, if you there's also another problem in that there is some of the diseases which were not as prevalent. I don't remember the particular one which destroys a lot of colonies, right? But there are several things that are responsible for that. But it is felt like pesticides is also a high part of the option. And the caller spoke about neem, just for you to know that, in fact, some people are making products out of neem. You can go in the store and you can buy pesticides which are neem extracts. So yes, neem is well known.
All of that.
Yeah, well known to have as a directin, I think it is, that is very effective on these things, right?
Efficacious.
Yes. And about the insects, remember they're good and bad insects. Okay? But I think what you mean is that a lot of the good insects have died out. The thing is, when you just spray wildly, somehow, I'm not sure why, but more of the good insects die than the bad ones. For one, a lot of these bad things, they are more adaptable. They have more oily and coverings that make them survive in more adverse circumstances.
And some of these microorganisms as well, these insects, are needed for the fertility of the soil as well. So when you kill them, actually you're affecting soil fertility. Am I not correct, Mr. Paul? And some of these microorganisms as well, these insects, are needed for the fertility of the soil as well. So when you kill them, actually you're affecting soil fertility. Am I not correct, Mr. Paul?
You are correct. But I wanna add something to what Mr. James said, right? A caller called in saying that he hadn't seen any butterflies, right? Now the butterflies are an adult stage to the worms, right? The worms, we call them larvae. Those things eat your crop. So if you ain't seen the nice pretty butterflies, before they turn into adults, there was some ugly little worms eating your garbage, eating your tomato, eating up your fruits, right? So if you ain't seen them, that is maybe a good thing.
I mean, you're using chemical.
I used to see, it's been a very, very long time. I know this is the national bird of Trinidad and Tobago, the hummingbird. But I have not seen a hummingbird here for a very, very long time.
They are around, but
but
they're very sensitive to chemicals. So, So
I haven't seen one in a long time. Working for you. Good afternoon.
No, but that's
yes. Good afternoon.
Yes.
June, and next thing these chemicals do, the earthworm them not so enrich the soil. These chemicals keep killing them. I don't see them much like when I was younger. Anyhow, have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Stay blessed. All right. Permit me to deal with the hummingbird issue, right? They're sensitive, right? They're sensitive to a lot of things. But we rarely ever spray the target flowers which the hummingbird feed on. You don't spray those things in the wild.
But I have on my hand because I'm coming back at him on this one because they may not feed on, but the chemical will spread in the air and land on the flowers that they feed on. And so, honestly, in my yard, I ban spraying because I have seen a few hummingbirds and I want to keep them. So,
the ladybird beetle and so on was the ladybird beetle was brought in for the control of what is that the mealybug, right? That was the big thing back then, right? When last you see somebody spraying a hedge, I just want to say a lot of the times when the hummingbird population is dropping, and I agree, but destruction of their habitat have a big part to play in that. They're very sensitive in that manner. I will not sit here and listen.
I don't disagree, Mr. Paul. We're not saying that the pesticide is the only problem.
But you mentioned
but
that
we're dealing with pesticides today. But they're dealing with
that's the topic today.
But another thing I want to add about the bees, the research is ongoing because of the large decline in population. But I wanted to point out that a third, according to the research I'm reading, a third of food production, the pollination comes from bees.
Yes.
So we're shooting ourselves in the foot if Mr. Paul, if
there's less pollination taking place if the bees are being wiped out.
Right.
If the bees are being wiped out. And so many fruits and
Yes.
so on because of the pollination. So it's affecting actually the food chain.
I am in agreement with all that, but watch me. It's true, like a lot of things that, are casualties of human civilization. Bees are part of it, wildlife are part of it.
The loss of habitat.
Loss of habitat.
That's one option.
Yeah, but
Diseases.
of course pesticides have a role to play, right?
Right.
But they're suggesting they have a major role. I think people are suggesting they have a major role.
Suggesting they have a major role, particularly here in the region, is very difficult. Now, Mr. James spoke earlier about organic farming being an option. If somebody pulls off organic farming here in St. Kitts, Caribbean chemicals have a price for them. First of all, the criteria for organic farming is different like in France it's different, California, different parts of the states it's different, right? But one of these things I constantly saw coming up is the proximity of a farm to its nearest farm, which is its neighbor, and to a major road. Watch me, St. Kitts ain't big enough for that. You understand?
So it means then that they will still be somehow affected by chemicals, the drift and so on from the...
One of the criteria to declare a farm organic, not only does the farm have to be organic, its buffer zone has to be organic, and its neighbors beyond that, their practices should be in line with
organic.
Organic.
Just say organic.
Because of the wind blowing stuff and
we are very thick. So the terminology may be a little different for insects and leaves on our
but we can agree
farm.
on that at least,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Also misuse, right? There's another aspect of organic agriculture that we do touch on. And we love it here. We love the granular fertilizers. We absolutely love that, right? And that is fine. I just want all you to know, if all you calling yourself organic and all using granular synthetic fertilizers, you're not organic, right? And next thing is our climate prohibits organic agriculture. When you see persons in Europe with a temperate zone and certain parts of the states,
we're in the tropics.
Exactly. And the tropical parts in the states, right? If they have an organic farm, I bet you it's greenhouse conditions. So we're talking about tunnels, right? For ventilation. You have plastic or glass, you have temperature control, and all humidity is monitored. Out here, you realize what happening for the past couple of days since in St. Kitts. Yeah, and farmers, you're welcome, because I know I just bring the rain every time I come here, right? But what is happening is that rain falling for a while, hot sun coming out. A little bit more rain, hot sun. See when that humidity rise, you have high proliferations of microorganisms, which cause disease in plants, right? And the insects, some of them absolutely love that. So it come like a double whammy. So imagine what I could say now, the climate more or less against you, and it favor the rapid proliferation of those pests. It becomes very difficult. But you do have organic product. Now, don't get me wrong, we haven't sold glyphosate in St. Kitts and Nevis for some time. those come from a different supplier. So don't think I defending it because we sell it.
Okay.
Right? It's just some strong beliefs I have. And of course, we have much more friendly alternatives like products such as Carista, right? Which the department have decided that, well, they have taken up on board, right? Serenade, which is a microorganism itself and is a fungicide, right? You have environmentally, well, products with an environmentally toxic, well, the profile, the toxicological profile of that product is friendly to the environment.
Okay.
All right, and it's just we doing our part. We doing our part, right?
We're almost out of time, but I know that part of the theme is really increased food safety. And Mr. James touched on it because he actually said that the food that is grown here is better than the food that is actually imported with all these chemicals. And so therefore, if we are going to increase food safety, what does that mean?
Well,
we increase what we grow
Local
here.
production.
Exactly.
Local production.
That's part of it.
Yes. A big part
Support
of
your
it.
farmers.
A big part of
Support
it.
your farmers.
Yeah, one of our major limitations is markets. When we produce, we don't always get it sold. So I think if a lot of what we produce go to waste, goes back to the pigs, goes back into mulching and so on. I think if our people would support our farmers more, then they'll realize that we'll be healthier. And a lot of the food-related problems that are out there does not really have to really be encountered here. Yes. So it's really about supporting local. I want to encourage us to really buy more local, whether it's directly from the farmer, on the road, in the market. Ideally, we should go to the market, but really buy local. It's better.
Right. Now we have a Pesticides Control Board. What is the function of that Pesticides Control Board?
The board regulates and makes a decision as to what kind of pesticides we will allow into the country and the conditions of use. There are myriad of pesticides manufactured each year. I mean, you can look at catalogs, hundreds, thousands, but you do not just want our persons to be exposed to just any and any. Sometimes kitchens love to be guided by cost. Sometimes we go out there and you see something and it costs, the cost seems favorable to you. It's cheaper or maybe free and you may want to walk with it. But no, what we do, we look at the constituents, we look at the composition. And in fact, we also not only look at the active ingredients, we try to see how much information we can get on the inert substances in there. And mention was made of some inert substances in glyphosate that is really of greater concern than the active ingredient itself, right? So on both.
So you have a lab?
No, we don't.
Is there a national lab?
No, we don't.
Is there
we
a
don't,
national
no,
lab?
It's a desktop research. It's a literature research. These things require very sophisticated tests, which we in the Caribbean really cannot do. So we depend on the more independent persons, like the Environmental Protection Agency, like the FAO, and other agencies, right, who have less personal, less interest in those products. Entities who are more interested in giving a balanced view.
Yes.
Especially the Environmental Protection Agency. We look at their work and we are guided by a lot of the results that they put out. So that is how we do it, but we're not able to actually run a test ourselves. If you're going to do tests, then sometimes you need 10 years and more. So we look at those who have done the test and we try to be guided by the results that they have. Is that the World Food Day?
You sort of preempted my question.
In October.
In October. Actually, it is October 2nd. And
16.
Yeah, it's celebrated. Isn't it on October 2nd? When is
the
it?
second week.
The second week of October.
Which
I
is
got that
usually
mixed up.
the 16th.
Which is the 16th, actually.
Yeah, World Food Day.
Right. And of course, the Sustainable Development Goals by 2020, and they're talking about zero hunger and so on by 2020. Is it possible?
The number of hungry are growing, actually.
But my question is, how does the Department of Agriculture plan to commemorate World Food Day?
We have a committee, and I think my committee is working tirelessly on putting off an excellent World Food Day set of activities for this year. As we speak, I think they were meeting this afternoon. I had to choose, so I'm here. We have a number of activities planned. I want to focus on one of them in particular. On the 18th, I think the 18th is the Thursday, because it ties in very nicely with what we're talking about today. We're having a double ceremony or I should say, a double occasion on the 18th. 18th is when we're going to be recognizing our farmers and fishers for their contribution to food security, for their contribution to zero hunger, right? That's the time we give out gifts and prizes to our producers. In addition to that, we're going to be having what we call a farmers market. In other words, we're going to invite our farmers and fishers to come and display their produce, display and sell all day. And this is going to take place, I don't know what's the official name of this place, but it's that green strip as you approach TDC Hardware. The green strip up Newtown on the left, as soon as you pass the playing field. All right? And then you just before you reach TDC Hardware.
The National Park.
The National Park,
yes.
right? we have gained permission to be there, so we're going to have our display. As early as 9 o'clock in the morning, the farmers are going to be there with all of the good pesticide-free produce, right, on sale. And so we want our folks to come there, buy your watermelon, buy your meats, buy your fish, what have you. And later in the afternoon, then we will have a prize giving ceremony awarding our farmers. So, we're looking forward to the entire country coming because we're talking about the farmers market. You're getting and now I think it puts in perspective when we talk about prices. Here we have the choice. You go in the supermarket for cheaper, pesticide less. You come to the farmers market, cost a little more, but more or less pesticide low, pesticide or even pesticide free. In the end, our health is better served by buying local. So I do hope that we will come and partner with us. There are other activities for World Food Day, like we're repeating the festival that we had, the beer and pork festival. We're repeating it. This time we're adding chicken as well. So it's chicken, and when we say chicken, we're talking about homegrown chicken, not no frozen thing. Things that we grow here. Traditionally, we have not been into the broiler industrial act, but now we have enough broiler to have a good session. So it's going to be broiler chicken, pork, again local, and beer. Kitishans seem to love the beer. So it's going to be a big session someplace in Bastille all afternoon. Just come, have a good time. I promote the pork and the chicken. Drink the beer if you want. And a range of activities. Church service. We're looking forward to a great week.
Okay, we can go on and on and on about pesticides and how we can be aware of pesticides, but really and truly we're out of time. I know that the details of the 2018 celebrations for World Food Day have not yet been announced, but I sure when they're announced,
yes.
They have not been. Have they?
No, we will release them. We will release them on Monday.
That's right. So we'll know the theme and all of that sort of a thing. I know. Last year it was about zero hunger.
The theme is up, but the theme is
well,
at this
that's
time. But
fine.
we will release the full program.
We have a minute to wrap up. Mr. Paula, you think you can do that in a minute?
Mr. Williams, I just want to thank you for inviting me on your show. Misuse, you was a formidable opposition, I must say. And Mr. James, always a good man. Always enjoy our discussions. Always invites me here, so which is I'm really thankful for. I hope we could continue working together, all of us, right, to basically mitigate the effects or the risks that my products and other suppliers pose to human health.
And I just want to leave with one thought or one point that, like I started with, all pesticides are not bad. And I think we didn't really focus on it, but it's if we follow the usage directions on the bottles or containers, the dosage, we could mitigate a lot of the effects that we're seeing now.
Yes,
I
so
think
we
it's
should use the
overuse, the indiscriminate use has led to some of the problems.
Yes.
And so we need to be more careful in our use of the chemicals, and the board will continue to work to make sure that the best chemical is imported from the Federation.
As a Department of Agriculture, because my hats are double here, it's our responsibility to be able to provide safe, healthy, adequate amounts of food for our country. We have to look at the pros and cons of everything, and we recognize that pesticides have a significant role in agriculture, but that they, like everything else, they're two sides to the coin. And so we will continue to be informed by the latest research and guide ourselves accordingly. A product which we find to be safe, we will recommend and will continue to use. Once the information is there that something has more deleterious effects than one can really manage, then the board has a responsibility to withdraw it. I want to assure the country that we'll continue to act in their best interest, and so that we'll be able to provide safe, healthy, adequate food to all.
Well, I want to thank all three of you so much.
Okay.
Mr. Paul, Kennedy Paul, who is the regional agronomist at Caribbean Chemicals, located in Trinidad. Thank you very much for being on our program today. Ms. June Hughes, of course, who is Senior Environmental Officer in the Department of Environment. Thank you so much, Ms. Hughes. And Mr. James, Melvin James, who is our very competent director at the Department of Agriculture. Thank all three of you for being on today's program. You have been listening to another Working for You program. Of course, we will be back next week with another interesting topic. I think it will be that of housing. And I want to thank the callers and all the listeners to today's program. Of course, every week we appreciate you very much. We will be back next week. Until then, I am Les Roy Williams. Have a good time.
Working for you. A weekly talk radio program which highlights developments of national interest and the activities of your St. Kitts Nevis government. Join host Les Roy Williams as he presents news, views, reports, and interviews about everything regarding the activities of the Team Unity government and the building of our communities and the development of St. Kitts Nevis. Tune in and call in to interact with your government and share your views regarding the upward forward development of your community and our beautiful Twin Island Federation. Working for You is weekly, every Wednesday live from 1:30 p.m. to 3 p.m. on ZIZ Radio, Win FM, and Sugar City FM with rebroadcast on participating stations. Working for You.